The long, hot summer of 1940 was a scorcher, with temperatures in the 90s. Who would have dreamed that this was wartime? Certainly not Londoners, many of whom continued to visit seaside resorts such as Brighton, Margate and Southend for the day, just across the Channel from occupied France. Little wonder they called it the phony war, until the government said otherwise.
It's important that we should be prepared against gas. Put it on for 10 to 15 minutes, one day a week. It may be a little irksome at first, but you'll soon get used to it.
Across Europe, countries were falling like dominoes. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, and then France. Here in London, unbeknown to most, the Port Authority was already preparing for war and the possibility of invasion. To the casual observer, it looked like business as usual in London's docks. Amid the teeming quaysides and busy warehouses, an atmosphere of optimism prevailed. In the period leading up to the war, the PLA commissioned a scale model of the port, together with a documentary film celebrating the wealth of its achievements. Perhaps the best barometer of the times is to listen to the pride and confidence which brims from this film.
Not only is London the greatest metropolis of the world, but also, and above all, it is a great seaport, a marine city whose main channels, tributaries and backwaters are crammed with traffic that passes to and from the open sea and through one of the most up-to-date dock systems in the world.
London's port lay at the heart of a vast empire, a veritable warehouse of the world, which handled over a quarter of the entire nation's imports. Factories, engineering workshops, processing plants and shipyards lined the riverfront and nearby districts. A fact not lost on the German High Command. Cripple the port and you paralyze London. Paralyze London and you kill resistance to invasion. The Port of London became Target Area A, an area which included the Ford plant at Dagenham, huge gasworks at Beckton, and the munitions factories of the Woolwich Arsenal, all en route up the Thames. Along with aerial photography, the Luftwaffe used their own model of London's port to train pilots in preparation for attacks. While London's dockers were busy loading ships, the Luftwaffe were loading a more sinister cargo. Saturday, the 7th of September, was another hot summer's day. Against the late afternoon sky, it was easy to mistake the silver glint of approaching planes for RAF maneuvers until the firestorm began. At about 5 p.m., the first of 400 Heinkel and Dornier bombers began their descent over London. Another 400 arrived around 8 p.m. to continue the attacks. Damage to the docks was devastating, and many lives were lost north and south of the river on what quickly became known as Black Saturday. Incendiary attacks began fires which burned for 5 days. Not since the Tooley Street fire of 1861 had South London endured such widespread destruction. On the North Bank, cargoes of flour, paint, rubber and sugar sent an inferno of flames into the night sky which was visible for miles around. This little-seen footage, filmed by the London Fire Brigade, is from September the 25th, 1940, after 18 days of successive bombardment. In the aftermath, Prime Minister Winston Churchill toured the stricken areas. Travelling on the PLA launch Nor, he took to the Thames to review the damage inflicted by enemy action. Here, Churchill is seen examining damage to flour mills at the Royal Victoria Docks and the devastation inflicted on the nearby community of Silvertown. London and its port remained a prime target for the next 4 years. Despite ferocious air raids, as well as V-1 and V-2 rocket attacks, the docks continued to operate. Indeed, the port played a vital role in supporting Britain's war effort, and port workers were responsible for the development of many secret wartime projects.
The bombers of World War II were a revolution in warfare, hitting the enemy deep behind the lines. Both politicians and generals were fascinated by the new weapon.
There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see.
Bombing brought about the first total war in history. Everyone was involved, everyone a target.
Gegenstände behaupten, das deutsche Volk wehrt sich gegen die totalen Kriegsmaßnahmen der Regierung. Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?
No one anywhere is safe from the bombs.
Preceded by a shower of flares, German bombers rained fire and high explosive bombs in their most savage attack on London. Here again is the blood, the sweat and tears that Nazi warfare brings to the men, women and children of city, town and village. Here again are the same firefighters who face peril and danger with the same grim determination and courage. Amid the rain of bombs and falling masonry, they fight the hell of Hitler's making, while our cameramen record for all time their stupendous task. Rocked by blast like some foul giant's breath and blistered by the intense heat, London's firemen carry on. Here are heroes in action. Thick smoke hangs over the heart of Britain as a choking dawn reveals the terrors of the night. London has been wounded during the hours of darkness, but what colossal strength runs in her veins. As hoses still play on the smouldering ruins, a fireman is heard to say, "Blimey, he wasn't half cross with us last night." Let every honor be given to the rescue parties, nurses and doctors who toil for hours among the wreckage, bringing help and easing the suffering of survivors. From out the bowels of devastation, they bring the injured to be ministered to by these gallant brothers and sisters of mercy. But in spite of it all, London carries on. Lummy, you ought to hear her carrying on. In no uncertain voice, she echoes Mr. Churchill's words, "We'll give it to them back." Yes, this time we take the gloves off. Hitler has called the tune, and we'll give it a name. Retaliation. Quoting an American newspaper, "The indiscriminate orgy of destruction is not the weapon to defeat England. From the dust of London arises only new life and hotter defiance. Hardened and angry, Britain fights back." We've got an adapted slogan now. Can we take it? Sure we can take it, right back where it came from.
The responsibility lies on the shoulders of one man. By his latest act of naked aggression, Hitler has committed a crime not only against Poland, but against the whole human race. Against the mothers and children leaving the cities of Britain under the great evacuation scheme with a smoothness and speed that avoids a single accident or delay. As they start out on what to them is the great adventure, already German troops, guns and planes have crossed the Polish border to kill and to destroy. So Britain prepares to fight. And never in our history have we been so united in the knowledge that our cause is just. We have no material interest in the quarrel between Germany and Poland, but we shall be fighting for something which is vital to our life and to the life of all civilized people. For in a world where the rights of the weak and the honor of the pledged word can be overruled by the high hand of military power, there is no tolerable life for nations or for peoples. So in spite of our hatred of war, we must meet force with force. And as our children move from the crowded cities to the kind care of newfound friends in safer places, what a tragic contrast to the preparations for the horrible struggle that may lie ahead. Terrible is the responsibility of the leader of the German Nazis for a catastrophe that will cause untold suffering and may set back civilization perhaps for centuries. He has rejected every appeal for a peaceful settlement from the Pope, whose followers regard him as the vicar of Christ on earth, from the King of the Belgians, whose youth was shaped by the tragic years of the last war, from the President of the United States, ardent fighter for peace, and from the Queen of the Netherlands. All have been rebuffed by the will of that one man in his senseless criminal greed for power. So German bombers swoop over Polish land. Polish cities and harbors are attacked. Even the capital of Warsaw itself is bombed. But Britain is ready. To quote the Prime Minister, the time for words is over. The time for action has come. The silence of preparation falls on London. Ministers assemble for another fateful cabinet meeting, even as Germany goes through the last diplomatic twists and turns in a final effort to justify the aggressive policy which he is determined to pursue. Poland's ambassador to Britain calls at number 10 Downing Street to report that Warsaw has been bombed. A little later, the German chargé d'affaires comes to deny the bombing, and he hardly seems to know which way to turn. But the denial was unnecessary, for later still comes an official confirmation of the raids. The King visits the Prime Minister in Downing Street, for His Majesty decided that Mr. Chamberlain was too busy to be called to Buckingham Palace. And the few hundreds who cheer the King in Downing Street are a symbol of the millions who stand behind him all over the world. As Mrs. Chamberlain and the Prime Minister drive to the Commons, the House assembles for a fateful last debate before Britain declares war not on the German people, but on the leaders of the Nazi regime. In this hour, there is not one atom of disunity between all parties. All are determined that the aggressors shall not escape the penalty for the monstrous crime that has been committed. All over Europe, peace-loving peoples await the dread news. In Holland, which remained neutral last time, but may find it harder to do so again. Holland prepares her supplies of food, calls out her reserves to defend her frontiers. For Holland knows that since Hitler has chosen war, in spite of all the chances given him to avoid it, war there must be. And Holland builds new battleships for her further protection if need be. And if the neutral nations prepare, how much more does the responsibility to do so lie upon us and our allies, who are facing the hardest task in our history? The Polish army is already engaging the invader, and Poland is ready. France has made every preparation on the chance that the inhuman ambition of the ruler of Nazi Germany would rush blindly to catastrophe. And France is ready too.
prototype, K5054, made its first ever flight from the Supermarine Works at Eastleigh in southern England, heralding the start of a legend that is just as powerful today as it was during those dark years of World War II.
The Supermarine Spitfire, the ultimate symbol of defiance and victory in the Battle of Britain. Fast, maneuverable, and strikingly elegant, the Spitfire was the cutting edge of RAF Fighter Command in its epic struggle against Hitler's Luftwaffe.
The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. Today we're going to talk about the Holocaust, which was an integral part of Nazism in World War II. The genocide of the Holocaust, millions of Jewish people were systematically murdered, shows humanity at its most depraved. And we've thought a lot about how much footage to show from the camps where so many millions were condemned to death. And we've decided not to have a thought bubble in today's episode, but we will be showing some archival footage, not least because anti-Semitic disinformation campaigns throughout the last 70 years have sought to minimize or outright deny that the Holocaust happened. Maybe there's no countering such conspiracy theories. The evidence of the Holocaust is vast, including hundreds of thousands of witness accounts, testimony from war crimes trials, and extensive documentation by the Nazis themselves of their attempts to systematically eliminate Jewish people from the world, and also others deemed inferior, including disabled people, Roma people, many Slavs, communists, and LGBT people. But we think it is important to try to tell the truth, both in what we say and in what we show. Some maintain that the Holocaust is incomprehensible, an outsized phenomenon beyond ordinary concepts of good and evil. And in some ways that's true, but it ignores the centuries of anti-Semitism that laid the groundwork for the dehumanization of Jewish people that intensified in the 20th century. It is critical that we remember the horrors of the Holocaust. History is, in the broadest sense, collective memory. And as Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel has written, without memory, there would be no civilization, no society, no future. And so let us try to remember. The beginnings of Nazi mass murder occurred late in the 1930s when doctors mobilized to murder some 200,000 disabled people in the T4 project, which aimed to save the purported purity of the German race. In Permission for the Destruction of Worthless Life, a noted jurist and a psychiatrist argued that people deemed without value should be eliminated. T4 murderers used carbon monoxide gas to kill their victims, including in mobile gas chambers. Many of these victims were taken from institutions without the knowledge of their families. The list of dangerous people or people without value resulted from multiple hatreds of disabled people, but also of Jewish people and Sinti and Roma people, and certain groups of Slavs such as Poles, Czechs, and Russians, also homosexuals, black people, and Jehovah's Witnesses, to name just a few. In the 1930s, political opponents and these marginalized people comprised those in early concentration camps, which were more like large-scale prisons, albeit one where murder was common, as distinct from the extermination camps that were set up later in the war, and which functioned primarily as places to systematically murder people. In 1939, as German soldiers moved through Poland, they murdered many Poles, including Polish Jews, especially going after the most literate citizens, like political leaders, teachers, and professors. And as Nazi forces moved eastward, Christian citizens joined in this murderous rampage against Jewish people as a supposedly righteous crusade against those who had killed Jesus. Jesus, for the record, was Jewish, and he was killed by Roman authorities, not Jewish ones, but none of this hatred was fact-based. Special Nazi forces called the Einsatzgruppen took the lead, but they were joined by civilians and policing officials. Hitler had always aspired to rid Germany of Jews, initially by means like forced migration or the creation of such dire living conditions that Jewish people would die at a rapid rate. And the creation of the Warsaw Ghetto embodied this hope for ethnic cleansing. Some 30% of the city's population was jammed into 2% of its space to live on drastically reduced rations and necessities such as coal and medical supplies. The more that die, the better, enthused Hans Frank, governor of German-occupied Poland. And then in the early years of the war, the plan for what became the Holocaust took shape, in part because it was felt that Polish people were not being converted into slave labor fast enough, and also because it was felt that Jewish people were not dying quickly enough. As the Nazi invasion of the USSR, Operation Barbarossa, began to fail by the end of 1941, Nazi officials set in motion a system of industrial killing modeled on the T4 program, including plans for transport of Jewish and other victims to extermination camps. They then communicated these plans to those responsible for carrying them out at the Wannsee Conference outside Berlin in January 1942. Jewish leaders were tasked with selecting members of their conquered communities, supposedly to be resettled in the East, but these were not resettlements. Instead, they entailed being transported to the new extermination camps and gassed on arrival, as was the case for most children and women, or worked to death, as was the case for boys and men and some women. Some camps, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, were both labor and extermination camps, while others, such as Chelmno, were solely to murder captives. And it should also be noted that mass killings continued around captured cities and towns, not just in extermination camps. Nazi soldiers who objected, and there were some, were simply given other assignments. It was possible, the record shows, to just say no. But many soldiers and other authorities believed in the so-called final solution of killing all Jewish people. Soldiers and other authorities were often white supremacists, although historians have differing judgments about the weight of other motivations, such as obedience to authority, the normalization of mass murder, or greed and opportunities to steal from victims, just to name a few of the possible motivations. Eventually, people were able to begin reporting not just the brutality of forced deportations, but also their lethal outcome. This was called the Jewish mouth radio. But resistance was incredibly difficult for people who were weakened by starvation and lack of medical care and a range of other physical and mental abuses. Still, in 1943, Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto used guns provided by the Polish resistance to rise up against their Nazi occupiers. The Germans slaughtered most of the ghetto inhabitants, with a few escapees joining other resistance groups in Poland. In the camps themselves, resistance was even less plausible for people living on 200 calories a day and constantly monitored by heavily armed guards. From the beginning, the Nazis, though proudly committed to, in Hitler's words, the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe, did a lot to hide their mass murder. Death camps had ornate entry gates adorned with cheering messages. Those to be murdered were greeted by bands playing merry tunes. So imagine the shock as new inmates were stripped of their illusions of safety in the camps. You see those flames? One newly arrived wife and mother was asked by a seasoned prisoner. That's the crematory over there. Call it by the name we use, the bakery. Perhaps it is your family that is being burned at the moment. Some miraculously survived. Women, raised to be guardians of tradition, often celebrated Jewish holidays and the birthdays of their fellow inmates and cared for one another when possible. And they were strengthened by these deeds. One chronicler of the death camps, the Italian chemist Primo Levi, credited his survival to another prisoner who shared his bread rations and did favors. Thanks to these acts, Levi wrote, I managed not to forget that I myself was a man. Serving in a camp where overworked and starved prisoners were to be immediately murdered, Levi described how the Nazi regime drained away the divine spark so that prisoners came to feel like non-men. He went on, if I could enclose the evil of our time in one image, I would choose this image which is familiar to me, a faceless man with head dropped and shoulders curved, on whose face and in whose eyes not a trace of thought is to be seen. Given that, he wrote, one hesitates to call them living, one hesitates to call their death. But people also kept their humanity and hope in spite of the odds against them and found ways to resist. In 1943, hundreds of captives rose up at the Treblinka extermination camp, killing Ukrainian guards. Although most of the rebels were killed, some successfully fled to join resistance forces. A year later, at Auschwitz, women prisoners smuggled in explosives that men used to blow up a crematorium and assassinate guards. But none of those resistors survived. Overall, deaths from the deliberately planned and executed extermination of Jewish people, the Holocaust, or Shoah, as it is known in Hebrew, are estimated at 6 million people, not to mention the abuse and torture of those who survived the liberation of the camps in 1944 and 1945. It's tempting to focus on those stories of survival because we have records and accounts of the experiences of people like Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel. But we have to remember that most people did not have miraculous escape stories. Most people were simply murdered for who they were. Of course, combatants in World War II also unleashed additional mass murder besides the Holocaust itself. In 1943, German forces uncovered victims of the 1940 Soviet execution of some 22,000 Polish military officers and professionals, engineers, professors, and lawyers, for example. Just like Nazi executions of the intelligentsia, the goal was to deprive a conquered people of their leadership. But Soviet executions did not primarily aim to bolster Russian blood or a Russian race, although with the outbreak of war, non-Russians were often driven out of businesses and some professions. But the Holocaust was very different because it was a systematic attempt to eliminate a people from the world via mass murder. It was genocide. Now, as we've mentioned, Jewish people were not the only victims of Nazi mass murder. Millions of non-Jewish Poles were also killed. In the Nazis' so-called racial science, Slavs were not seen as all the same. Slovaks and Croats were seen as superior to Poles and Czechs, for example. And Russians were seen as among the lowest Slavs because they were seen as Judeo-Bolsheviks, a term that combined anti-Semitism with the hatred of Soviet communism. Obviously, although some Bolsheviks were Jewish, many were not, Lenin and Stalin, to name just two of the most notable examples. But German soldiers murdered freely, motivated by the propaganda and speechifying filled with hatred for these twin demonized entities. Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Belarusians, and others also joined in the slaughter because they too had been taught to hate Jewish people and had age-old animosities toward Russian might in the region and newer animosities toward Bolshevik ambitions for conquest in Eastern Europe. Often, individuals didn't need encouragement by the Germans for murder, and even murdered in advance of their arrival because they wanted to help the Nazis out and also take the possessions of their murdered neighbors. One notorious case occurred in Jedwabne, Poland, where townspeople rounded up their Jewish neighbors, raped and beat to death many of them, and burned the rest alive in a barn. Then, following the Nazi example, they took their neighbors' possessions for themselves. So, by the end of World War II, had people taken a lesson from all this? I don't know. Racism and jingoistic nationalism remained powerful forces in European life, and in human life, as indeed they are today. In some towns, surviving Jewish people who returned to claim their property were driven out or even murdered, and the diverse group of refugees who sought safety and shelter after the war often found none, as indeed Jewish people trying to escape Europe in the 1930s and early 1940s had been denied refuge around the world. After the war ended, many survivors of the camps gathered in port cities of the Mediterranean, waiting for ships to take them anywhere that would accept them. In the US, where anti-Semitism remained high, only 5,000 Jewish people were allowed entry. And that's very important to understand. Anti-Semitism was not only a destructive force in Europe, then or now, and that consistent long-term imagining of Jewish people as evil or inferior or inhuman allowed the horrors of the Holocaust to happen unchecked and kept Jewish people from the safe harbor they might otherwise have found. And that is something to consider not only about history, but also about our world today. As the Israeli Holocaust scholar Yehuda Bauer has written, "Thou shalt not be a victim, thou shalt not be a perpetrator, but above all, thou shalt not be a bystander." Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Thank you for watching Crash Course, which is made here in the Jaden Smith Studios in Indianapolis and made possible by everyone who contributes at patreon.com/crashcourse. We have many other Crash Courses for you to watch. I hope that you will enjoy them. Thanks again for being here. And as they say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.
The Axis invaded the Soviet Union, planning to overrun the European part of it before the onset of winter. However, the resistance was stronger than expected, and by the beginning of October they had expended much of their offensive capabilities. Assuming that the Red Army was on the brink of collapse, they launched an all-out attack. The Soviet Union had still resources left, and the Axis forces found themselves overextended. The Red Army was seriously weakened, but it did not let the opportunity slip and counterattacked with all available forces, forcing the Axis into a retreat. In the Black Sea region, the Soviets undertook an amphibious operation. They landed their forces in the Crimea, survived the Axis counterattack, and made preparations to take the whole peninsula. In Ukraine, they pushed towards the Dnieper River and managed to gain ground before their attack was contained. Near Leningrad, the Red Army broke a breach into the German line and pushed into their rear, threatening to unhinge their front. The Soviets concentrated most of their forces against the Army Group center. After having pulled back from the approaches of Moscow, the Germans decided to stand fast and regroup on their present positions. This gave the Red Army a chance to conduct an encirclement of the German forces. Overextension had created several gaps in the German lines, and Red Army exploited them in order to bypass and cut off the German units. Despite of moving behind the German lines, they did not have enough strength to cut the main railway supplying the German forces, and the Germans were able to cut off and contain the breakthroughs. In the north, the Soviets encircled the German Second Corps at Demyansk, but it was sustained by air supply. After realizing that it lacked the strength to conduct a major attack, the Red Army concentrated its efforts on the most promising sectors. However, by this time the Germans had secured their position, and the attacks achieved only minimal progress. After having reorganized further, the Germans were able to conduct small offensives of their own in the most critical sectors. They destroyed some Soviet units in the Army Group Center's rear and re-established a land connection with the Demyansk pocket. As the winter ended, both sides drew up their plans for the summer. The Soviets were rebuilding the Red Army, but it would be far from ready by summer, and the Axis would still have the upper hand. The Soviets believed the Axis would use this to undertake a major offensive towards Moscow and prepared to take a defensive stance. The question was what to do with the many salients that had been formed in the front. They provided good opportunities for the encirclement of both the Axis and Soviet units and were difficult to defend. In order to conduct a successful defense, they would have to be eliminated. One option was to abandon the salients, the other was to destroy the Axis-held salients. Although it was not clear if the Red Army would have enough strength to do so, they decided to risk it. They would destroy the Axis forces in vulnerable positions, and this would drain the strength from the main Axis attack. After the main attack was repelled, the build-up of the Red Army would have reached a level that would allow it to go on a major offensive. The Germans were indeed preparing to carry out a major attack. Comparing with the previous year, their resources had decreased and they were unable to mount a large Barbarossa-style offensive. Instead, they planned to undertake several consecutive offensives in order to destroy the Soviet Union. As the first step, they would capture the Caucasus oil fields in order to deny the Soviet Union most of their oil supply and gain a long-term source of it themselves. This would allow the Germans to continue waging the war in full capacity. Next, Leningrad would be taken, and then the Murmansk Railroad would be cut, depriving the Soviet Union of its main sources of foreign aid. Meanwhile, in the center, the German forces would hold their forward positions in order to provide a good springboard for an offensive. After the Red Army had been weakened by previous steps and the Axis had freed up their forces, they would occupy the main Soviet industrial base in central Russia. Before and during the main operations, the Axis would clear out as many of the contested areas as possible to free up more troops. The first Soviet attack was in the north, where they attempted to push the Axis forces back in order to increase the security of the Murmansk Railroad, but they failed to make any serious advances in the rough terrain and went on a defensive. The next operation was meant to destroy the most vulnerable German salient at Demyansk, but the Germans continued to hold on to their positions and their progress was minimal. The next operation was undertaken by the Axis in the southernmost part of the front. In the Crimea, the open steppe suited well for close air support and the Germans used it to break through the Soviet lines. The Red Army had previously conducted several offensives and its forces were deployed forward, lacking the depth to contain the Axis breakthrough. The Soviets were unable to stop the Axis advance and had to abandon the peninsula. In Ukraine, the Soviets had finished their preparations first and went on the offensive, attempting to take Kharkov with a two-pronged attack. The Axis forces were not far behind in their deployment, and 5 days after the beginning of the Soviet attack, they went on an offensive of their own. The Red Army did not anticipate such a move, and the German units managed to cut off the attacking Soviet troops and destroy them. In the north, near Leningrad, the Soviets were unable to fully exploit their breakthrough. Having realized the vulnerability of their position, they decided to evacuate the salient. However, the Germans beat them to it and cut the neck of the salient. During the next month, the encircled Soviet forces were eliminated. In the center, both the Soviets and the Germans were preparing their own offensives. As the German operation was of smaller scale, it was ready first, and they proceeded to clear out the pocket south of the railroad. Soon, they had full control over the territory, although part of the Soviet forces managed to escape and reach their main lines. After having regrouped their forces, they turned against the northern salient. They cut its communications with the main Soviet front and pushed into it, eliminating most of the Soviet units. Destruction of the Red Army formations behind the German lines forced a change in the Soviet plans, and their offensive in the center was postponed. In the south, the failure of the Kharkov offensive had left the Red Army in disarray, and the Germans decided to exploit the opportunity. They conducted two smaller attacks, but this time the Soviets pulled their forces back and did not offer strong resistance. The amount of prisoners taken was limited. Now everything was ready to carry out the German plan to capture the Caucasus. As the first step, the Axis forces would encircle and destroy the Soviet formations on their southern flank. Then they would advance and take strong defensive positions along the Volga and Don rivers to cut the communications between the Soviet heartland and the Caucasus. This would shield the Axis forces in the south from the main force of the Red Army. As the third step, the Axis forces would move into the Caucasus and take over the oil fields. The first German attack reached the Don River as planned. The Soviets expected that they would turn north towards Moscow and deployed their reserves, conducting a counterattack from this direction. In the south, the Red Army began to withdraw to avoid encirclement. Because the German plan was founded on the assumption that the Soviets would avoid retreat, as they had done in the previous year, they were now confronted with the possibility of Soviet forces escaping the encirclement. They altered the plan, sending the forces immediately to the south in order to catch the Soviet units. However, the Soviet formations further south joined the retreat, allowing most of them to escape the encirclement. By this time, the Soviet command had understood the German intentions and had deployed their strategic reserves to keep the Axis away from the Volga River. Meanwhile, their other forces retreated south over the Don. During that time, the Germans had also captured Sevastopol, and when it was clear that the Caucasus direction was properly covered, they sent their freed up forces north to take Leningrad. In the central part of the front, the Germans were finishing the preparations to destroy another Soviet salient, but before that, the Red Army had finished deployment and commenced its offensive against the Army Group center. The Germans reinforced the defenses and then attempted to cut the southern Soviet salient with weaker forces, but were unable to. The terrain in the area of the Soviet attack was not suitable for the use of heavy weapons, and the main front of the fighting fell to the infantry, which suffered heavy casualties. Despite pushing the Germans back, they were unable to destroy their forces. Limited attacks continued for a month more, but they failed to secure more territory. In the north, the Germans planned to use reinforcements from the Crimea to cut off Leningrad. In addition, they planned to undertake several operations in order to improve their defensive positions. The Red Army was meanwhile preparing to re-establish the land connection to Leningrad by pushing through the thin strip of the German-held territory. The Soviets attacked first, and the Germans had to use the reserves to repel them. The defense tied up their forces, and they lost the time they needed for the encirclement of Leningrad. In addition, they could spare enough troops only to widen the neck of the Demyansk salient. In the south, the Axis had failed to destroy the Soviet formations opposing them, but in the same time, the quick retreat had thrown the Soviet forces into disarray, putting them in need of reorganization. Meanwhile, the Axis troops were left unscathed. The Germans decided to solve the situation by not allowing the remaining Soviet units to reorganize and moved immediately towards the Caucasus, while the other part of their forces would secure the flank. The Soviet forces continued their retreat until they reached the Caucasus Mountains. There they made a stand and dug in on the bottlenecks. In the north, the Germans used the open steppe terrain to outmaneuver the Soviet reserves and moved slowly towards Volga. By the end of August, they had reached the river and entered the city of Stalingrad and began to slowly clear out the city. In the Caucasus, the German Alpine troops traversed the mountain passes, but they lacked the strength to reach the sea and were stopped on the southern slopes. During the following months, the spread out Axis forces continued to make small gains. Although the Axis had made serious advances, they were unable to deliver a crippling blow to the Soviet war effort and decided to complete their objectives in the next year. They anticipated that the Soviets would have enough strength for a winter offensive in one sector and that they would attempt to destroy the salient in the central part of the front. The Germans countered the threat by deploying their reserves. Meanwhile, in the south, the Axis forces attempted to improve their positions as much as possible before the onset of winter. They tried to cut off the Red Army units in the Black Sea coast, but they could not break through the hills. In the central Caucasus, the Germans caught the Red Army off balance and moved deep into the hills until the Soviets redeployed their units. After that, coming of the winter snow put an end to the offensives in the Caucasus. By the Volga, the Axis forces had advanced steadily during the last months, and in the middle of November, they were in the process of removing the last Soviet presence in Stalingrad. They were not expecting a major attack in the south, and instead of creating a defense in depth, the forces of the Axis flank were deployed offensively, concentrated in the east at the point of effort. In this situation, the Soviet breachheads over the Don were considered of secondary importance and were covered by Romanian forces, who lacked anti-tank equipment and were not keen on fighting. Contrary to German estimations, the Red Army had the forces to conduct 2 winter offensives. They had deployed their second force in the south to make full use of the Axis deployment in this sector. The Red Army managed to achieve surprise and overran the Romanian forces opposing them. Then they broke into the undefended Axis rear, cutting off their forward units. Next, they had planned to reach the sea and cut off all the Axis forces in the Caucasus region. However, some of the Red Army forces had to be diverted to repel the German attempt to relieve the Stalingrad pocket, and the advance could not be conducted to full extent. The year in the south ended with the Soviets crushing all Axis hopes to sustain their forces in the Caucasus and Stalingrad and were threatening to advance into Ukraine. At the same time, the Red Army was attempting to cut the German salient in the center. The Germans had deployed their reserves and were prepared for the attack. The Soviet attacks were met with staunch defense, and where they were able to penetrate the German defenses, they were thrown back by counterattacks. The Soviet offensive failed to achieve its objectives, and only in the western sector did the Red Army achieve some success. Thus, 1942 came to an end. The Soviets had secured the oil, and now the Wehrmacht lacked a proper plan to defeat the Soviet Union. The Soviet forces were moving west with the hope to inflict a decisive defeat.
In 1931, when Japan attacks Manchuria, Japan commandeers the Chinese Eastern Railway, which is supposed to be under Russia's purview. And the people in the Politburo are telling Stalin, look, we gotta be aggressive against this. And Stalin says, look, I don't want to raise tensions against another great power. Let's just let this slide. Let's keep tensions low. And this is actually quite similar to what happens with splitting up Poland in 1939 and then Barbarossa, where in this case, that actually did lead to a war. But this idea that we'll keep the tensions low, I won't plan for Operation Barbarossa.
Hitler comes to power in 1933. Stalin knows that that is the main problem. He sells the Chinese Eastern Railway to Japan in 1935. It's like, make that problem go away for now, monetize it, get the Japanese to give you some money for it, and we're just not going to worry about Manchuria right now because we have Nazis to worry about.
The bigger point was that in both theaters, he makes this calculation that I'm going to let certain things slide so that I don't have to face off against this great powers on my border. I don't want to go to war with them.
Right.
In the case of Japan, it works because Japan decides to attack China and not Russia. In the case of, obviously, Germany, it doesn't.
Oh, yeah. In Germany, he's trying to run the same script, and he thinks that this is going to work for him. But that's what the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is about. And not remotely. He needed to read Mein Kampf
right.
to understand. You're a menu item for Hitler. He is eventually going to come around.
We sent Stalin $1 trillion worth of aid. Should we have cut off Lend-Lease aid after 1943?
Bad idea. There's a main theater in the war. How do I know what the main theater is? That's where most of the people fighting are. Russians fought between 2/3 and 3/4 of the Nazi army always. That makes the Eastern Front the main theater. So you all think the Normandy invasion was a big deal. No, that is a peripheral operation. It is peripheral to the main theater. And if the Russians hadn't been doing Bagration, this big operation that coincides with Normandy, no way would we ever have gotten on to the continent, and that's in 1944. So cutting Lend-Lease aid, insane. For Britain, if it wants to get to its empire, back in the day, it wants to go through the Suez Canal. That requires the cooperation of Spain, France, Italy. And if you think in World War II, well, fall of France, fascist sympathies of Spain, and then Italy is part of the Axis. Britain is in real trouble. So in 1940, Britain's in a world of hurt. It's facing two continental powers, Germany and Russia, that are both have these expansive empires they want to create. They want to divide Europe and then the rest of the world. Bad news for Britain. But 1941, when Hitler decides he needs Russia too, and then Russia decides, the one that's attacking me is probably the major problem, not the other one. So Stalin is going to swap sides, and he's going to be coordinating with Britain. So that's better from Britain's point of view than having two continental powers trying to deal with it. So now it's down to one. So the Russians had tried to be working out some deal with the British prior to all of this. And the British are, because the communists have been trying to destabilize them ever since the Bolshevik Revolution, and they didn't get just how lethal the fascists were in Germany, that they weren't just run-of-the-mill authoritarians. They had this whole genocide component that went with them. And so the British are thinking, well, the real threat are the communists in Russia. And they're right, long-term they are the real threat, but in the more medium term, it's the Germans are. And so it takes blitzkrieg for the British to go, uh-oh. And then they're willing to team up with Russians. And Russia's willing to team up with them, right? German invasion transforms what had been primary enemies. He takes that role, being primary enemies for both Britain and Russia.
of June 1941, Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Its target, Stalin's Soviet Union. It was the culmination of Hitler's thinking and theorizing about dealing with what he perceived to be his biggest enemy, Soviet communism. 3.8 million Axis soldiers would invade and fight in the 5-month operation to destroy the USSR. The Red Army, caught off guard by the timing of the German assault, its officer corps fatally weakened by political purges, reeled under the attacks. The German armies concentrated on 3 main objectives: Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. In the first 30 days, Field Marshal Ritter von Lieb's Army Group North drove to within 135 miles of Leningrad, while Hitler's Finnish allies also attacked towards the city. In the centre of the front, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Centre drove 480 miles forward. Many of the Soviet Union's most important cities fell to the Germans. On the 17th of July, von Bock captured Smolensk, the key to Moscow. At the same time, Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, cut a swathe through the Ukraine. It appeared as though the Soviet Union was finished. Stalin had 800,000 men with which to defend the capital, but of the 83 divisions available, only some 25 were fully operational. The Germans launched Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, on the 30th of September 1941. Army Group Centre had to overcome a series of elaborate defensive lines, centred on cities in the path to Moscow. The 2nd Panzer Group took Oryol, 75 miles south of the Soviet first main defensive line. 3 days later, the Panzers captured Bryansk, while the German Second Army attacked from the south. The Soviet 3rd and 13th Armies were encircled. In the north, the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies attacked Vyazma, trapping 4 Soviet armies. The Germans had cracked Moscow's first defensive line and captured over 663,000 prisoners, from a total of 3 million captured since the start of Barbarossa. Stalin had only about 90,000 men and 150 tanks left to defend Moscow itself. On the 13th of October, the 3rd Panzer Group was only 87 miles from Moscow. Martial law was declared in the city. But the weather was bad, with heavy rain and snow that turned the roads into mud. German tanks, with their narrow tracks, struggled to cope. On the 31st of October, a temporary halt to the advance was called, so that the Germans could reorganize their precarious supply situation. This gave the Soviets a breathing space. Stalin organized 11 new armies that included 30 divisions of tough Siberian troops better able to cope with such conditions. 1,000 tanks also arrived. As the temperature fell, the mud froze and the German advance resumed on the 15th of November. The German plan was to move the 3rd and 4th Panzer armies across the Moscow-Volga Canal and envelop the city from the northeast. The 2nd Panzer Group would attack Tula, then close on Moscow from the south. These movements would cause the bulk of the Soviet armies to move to deal with these threats. As they did so, the German 4th Army would attack the centre. For 2 weeks, short of fuel and ammunition, the German armies fought forward towards the city. In the south, the Soviets stopped the 2nd Panzer Group. On the 22nd of November, Siberian units counterattacked and defeated the 2nd Panzer. But the 4th Panzer Group managed to push the Soviets back and cross the Moscow-Volga Canal, the last major obstacle before the city itself. Units of the 7th Panzer Division were now 22 miles from Red Square and the Kremlin. But this group got no further forward on the 28th of November when a powerful Soviet counterattack pushed them back. Northwest of Moscow, the Germans reached Krasnaya Polyana, now Lubanya, just 18 miles from the Kremlin. But again, stiff Soviet resistance and German supply problems stopped them cold. However, the German 258th Infantry Division got closer. Part of the division's Panzer Pioneer Battalion appeared to have discovered a gap in the Soviet lines. On the 2nd of December 1941, a small number of light vehicles and motorcycle combinations reached the township of Khimki, close to the Moscow Ring Road. I accidentally visited Khimki some years ago when I missed a connecting flight at nearby Sheremetyevo Airport and spent a night in the town. And this is all that the Germans managed as well. Officers claim to have seen through binoculars the gleaming golden domes and spires of Red Square and the Kremlin from their position at Khimki. They were 14 miles from the Kremlin. But the story is either exaggerated or a case of mistaken identity. Moscow in 1941 was fairly low-rise, so the Kremlin's buildings certainly stood out on the skyline. But many high-rise Soviet apartment blocks had been built along the main highways out of the city center. Also, Khimki in 1941 contained no tall buildings from which to get an elevated view of the far distance. Another problem with the story was the fact that the Soviets had camouflaged both Red Square and the Kremlin. The golden spires had been painted in dark colors, the Kremlin walls painted to look like buildings with windows. Camouflage and plywood structures had been erected on Red Square to confuse the street layout from the German Luftwaffe, and Lenin's mausoleum had been disguised as a two-story residential building. In the snowy, cold conditions, the Germans probably saw snow and frost reflecting off the roofs in strong sunlight. Or they saw other towers and church domes in the general direction of central Moscow. Whatever the truth, Khimki was as far as the Germans managed to get towards Moscow. The small number of German troops in the township waited for support that never came, and on the 3rd of December, a Soviet force of local militia, supported by a few T-34 tanks, managed to push them out of Khimki. If you want to see the spot today, the point of furthest German advance has been marked since 1966 by a memorial consisting of giant Czech tank traps at kilometer 23 on the Leningradskoye highway into Moscow, next to a giant IKEA furniture store. As severe winter weather descended and supply problems continued, the German offensive against Moscow stalled. On the 5th of December, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack. By the 7th of January 1942, when the Soviet offensive halted, the Germans had been pushed back between 60 and 150 miles from Moscow. The battle for Moscow was over. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share. Also visit my new audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. Details below. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box.
followed. But you can look in the West, in World War I, soldiers would go up and over the trenches, and they knew exactly what was going to happen to them. And yeah, there were people who didn't, and then they were court-martialed and shot. A lot of people were shot in World War I. But there's been a change in society about what young men are willing to do when their officers start telling them. The way the Russians solved this problem in Ukraine, but Stalin would do this too, is you send people up ahead, and then you've got the KGB or whatever, the killer unit, so that anyone who tries to go the wrong way in the battlefield, they get machine gunned by their own side. That's one way to get an army to go forward, and that's what Putin is doing right now. But anyway, it's in more democratic places, people aren't willing to go along with this now, but in the West, we did it too.
America would never be the same. America would never be the same.
By 1943, women made up 1/3 of the American labor force. 20 million women were working outside the home, not just at typewriters and sewing machines. Many were doing jobs that had been considered exclusively male.
So she gave up her nylons for coveralls and gloves and put her heart into change. It all started a movement when she overcame her fears. America would never be the same. America would never be the same. America would never be the same.
Isn't this a funny place for you?
Not if it helps win the war.
But after clerking in a fashionable store...
I like it here, and it saves my clothes.
Yes, I suppose it would.
Did you ever try pleasing a bunch of women shoppers all day?
No, I never did.
Well, here I just have to please the boss, and he's a man.
And the work isn't too hard for you?
No, I used to work in a butcher's shop. I like this better. It's more excitement.
Isn't this pretty hot for you, Miss Spillane?
Well, I hear it gets kind of hot around the kitchen stove, too.
I never thought of that.
Yes, and it gets pretty hot out there in the South Pacific.
During the war, almost 15,000 American workers were killed or permanently disabled in industrial accidents. More than 3 million other men and women were injured. It was a dangerous environment, but that was something the government and the newsreels did not talk about very much. The emphasis was on patriotism and production, and in a manner peculiar to the times, sex.
Once upon a time, there were beauty parades. All the girls needed was youth and culture. But this is war. Today's beauty contests are in the shipyards, on the assembly lines. Here at Marine Ship, California, women welders have a lunchtime contest. Men workers vote on each girl's appearance, job record, and attendance. For now, Miss America is at work. The winner is expert welder Mrs. Gladys Griffin, mother of 2, and Mr. Griffin's in the service.
I felt really very spirited and very proud. I was very young, I was 18, and I felt something about camaraderie of workers, generally men and women, and especially sisterhood among women, that I have never encountered before or since, because it was a very special, special time. I remember feeling very good, and I felt good the whole time at doing this work that had traditionally been men's work, and I felt proud, and I felt able and capable, and that I did a good job, and that was true of all the women.
I know how the men felt.
They really resented us invading their territory. That was my concept of what was going on, because a lot of us were young and some of us weren't too bad looking, and they were very confused. And here were all these young girls and women coming into their territory and trying to do the same things they were doing. I feel that that was the beginning of women's liberation movement. Maybe they didn't realize it at the time, but it was, because we showed that we could do a man's job and that there weren't that many differences.
We were really good, you know. We were good at what we did. We felt good about what we were doing. And there was a special feeling, I think, among the women that we were part of this wonderful effort of building a ship, a beautiful ship, a raw hulk that became transformed into this beautiful, shining ship that then we would see go off the waves. It was a wonderful experience.